Good evening and shalom. Welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I'm your host, CJ Cox, and we got a lot of interesting news for you today. We're going to be talking a little bit about a new constitutional amendment proposed by a Republican senator. Excuse me. We have a lot of Pope-centric news today, actually, and we'll even have some interesting comments that I want to make in regards to some interesting comments already made by one Chris Matthews. So quite a few interesting things to be talking about here today, at least in my own personal opinion, but of course they're interesting in my opinion. That's why I'm doing this show and trying to bring them out to you guys, right? Nonetheless, before we get into any of that, there is something I do want to briefly discuss, as has kind of become a tradition on this program, discussing something that isn't actually going to have an article read about it. Although it is actually, the thoughts were inspired by an article that I had recently seen and will be reading and responding to on my own apologetics program from Dr. Michael Brown on stream. Now, for those of you who do not know, Dr. Michael Brown is actually not a political pundit. He's a Christian apologist. So he does shows similar to like my unapologetics, or my unapologetics, yeah. Now, granted, I highly doubt anybody watching me does not know who Michael Brown is, but just in case, I figure, he's significantly more popular than me, but like I said, just in case, I figure I'll just let you guys know. Nonetheless, he recently did an article. He writes articles occasionally for the stream and Christian Post and things like that. Usually I agree with them. There is a common source of disagreement between me and Dr. Michael Brown. About President Trump. He has been a supporter of President Donald Trump, at least since President Trump became the Republican nomination. He was not a supporter of President Trump during the primaries. To the best of my knowledge, he was actually a supporter of Ted Cruz. I would have also been a supporter of Ted Cruz there as well. But he's been saying that since Trump has been elected, he has earned his vote with his pro-life policies, protection of religious liberty, and appointing of conservative justices. And, of course, his pro-Israel policy has definitely come into play in there as well. The reason this has been a common, point that I would always disagree on, of course, as you guys would know if you've watched this before, is that I'm not a Trump fan by any stretch of the imagination. I am a conservative, but I happen to think he's a jack conservative or a big city Democrat, if I was actually being more accurate. He only became a Republican in like 2011, and he was a Democrat all before then, right? He was somebody who has been supporting abortion and gun bans and things like that well before he became president, and then all of a sudden he had to change, quote unquote. And then if you actually look at his policies, it really doesn't look like he did have a change, at least on a lot of things. There is, kind of back and forth when it comes to his pro-life policies. On one end, we did have the opportunity to defund Planned Parenthood. Both chambers of the House were conservative. Trump himself, of course, being in office, it wouldn't be anything that would go to the courts because it's nothing more than a defunding of Planned Parenthood with any sort of federal funds, right? And they didn't do it. On top of that, when he had the opportunity to appoint some very conservative Supreme Court justices, he didn't pick people who were liberal by any stretch of the imagination, but as I pointed out numerous times at the time, neither Gorsuch or Kavanaugh is a very serious conservative. Gorsuch much more conservative than Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh, I think, is honestly as wishy-washy as they get. Kavanaugh also had some other very serious problems, like thinking that a president should not be able to be investigated, which is insane. I mean, what kind of power are you trying to actually give to the president of the United States? I would not be surprised if that actually had something to do with why Trump wanted him to be on the office. Now, of course, that is completely, disregarding anything that might have been said by Christine Blasey Ford. That had nothing to do with why I disapproved of Kavanaugh. Those charges were clearly bogus, right? And that is the thing that I think a lot of people. Well, hang on. I'm not going to get it there quite yet because I have other things to explain. So when it comes to that, wishy-washy sort of judges, not defunding Planned Parenthood, things like that, there's a lot of negative there from the pro-life position. On the other hand, he has had a lot of conservative justices appointed on the appeals court levels and the different circuit courts. He's definitely closed a lot of different. Well, I can't know. excuse me, I stutter a lot. I don't necessarily know how much he personally had to do with the closing, but something like 500 abortion clinics have closed since he's become president, so that's certainly a good thing. He's recently called on Congress to pass a law that would actually outlaw late-term abortion, and he was the first president to speak at the March for Life. And of course, who can forget the Mexico City policy? So kind of back and forth when it comes to his pro-life policy. His pro-religious policy, once again, very similar. He did get rid of a lot of, 501c3, what would you call it, restrictions on churches and their ability to speak politically and things like that. And he has, at least in rhetoric, been a defender of the right of Christians to have free speech and things like that. He hasn't done anything in regards to the massive deplatforming, and I don't know how much constitutionally there is he can do, so that's an interesting question, definitely, that I'm definitely not the most qualified to answer. I'd admit that. But nonetheless, he's also been very buddy-buddy with some of the worst religious elements that I think you can find, like the Catholic Church, like Saudi Arabia. As much as I, don't agree with the whole Zionist conspiracy theory, I'm still not interested in anybody, having Kabbalah or Noahide laws being signed or re-signed or anything like that, even if it is in ceremony only, right? That's, problems I've had with Donald Trump there. Obviously, his pro-Israel policy I agree with, but let's go to some of his other policies, like his policy on guns. He's been quoted as saying, let's go ahead and take the guns and due process later, which, of course, is the exact opposite of what due process is, as defined very clearly by the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. He has been for things like assault weapons ban, high-capacity magazine ban, bump stock bans. He said he's not a fan of silencers, right? When it comes to things like... excuse me, I just kind of lost my train of thought there because I kind of started thinking about the Roger Stone thing. And, that's another one that's kind of back and forth. He did pardon the Hammonds. That was a good pardon. He did not pardon Roger Stone, even though Roger Stone is clearly deserving of a pardon. And I wonder why. Obviously, some people say, well, it's, somebody who he's politically associated with, and therefore that could be a form of political suicide or whatever. But to be perfectly frank with you, I don't think that kind of stuff should matter. I think principle should matter. When it comes to things like getting us out of foreign wars, Donald Trump said he was going to do that. Did not happen. When it said that we were going to be friendly with Russia, did not happen. He said that he was going to be, a firmly Zionist president, which for those of you who are Christian Zionists and say that he's been supporting Israel, in a lot of ways he has. He did move the embassy, very good, right? He did recognize a lot of their rights, to the Golan Heights, to the Judea and Samaria, those settlements there, very good. However, he also has proposed a peace plan giving away land that does not belong to them to Arab invaders, right? Which is not if you're actually somebody who believes in the concept of Zionism, which Zionism is not a conspiracy theory, by the way. Zionism is just simply the idea that the Jews should have self-determination and self-governance, and specifically in the Holy Land, i.e. Israel, right? Well, he's just as wishy-washy as everybody else has been. When it comes to things like the TPP, he got us out of the TPP, and then he got us immediately back in to the TPP. When it comes to things like leaving NATO and etc., leaving the North American Union, leaving NAFTA, never happened. Obamacare being repealed, we just slapped Trump care on it, right? And etc., with all of these. And bigger than any of that has been this problem that he is actually going to, and not actually is going to, but he has completely eroded any sort of, idea that we have about morality and honor in the president's office. And you can call me a stickler or a Puritan if you like, but the basic fact of the matter is the man is thrice married. The man has been accused of sexual assault. The man has been accused of spousal abuse. The man has been accused and has almost definitely cheated on his wives, with porn stars, I might add, right? The man has endorsed torture. The man has clearly said that he has never repented. Excuse me. He's a habitual liar. He's a celebrity. He's very arrogant and egocentric and greedy, right? He's been somebody who has sexually objectified women, both in his businesses and in his rhetoric and in his television shows. Obviously, his wife has posed nude, for crying out loud, right? And why is that all relevant? Well, because it used to be the conservatives, the traditionalists, the Christians who would defend our need to actually have morality in politics and morality in the celebrity sphere and morality in the different aspects of public life, which I agree with, which is why I have been consistently against Donald Trump. And what we have seen recently, which I kind of called this out, although I was thinking it was actually going to come up with Kamala Harris over how she got involved with politics, sleeping with the mayor of San Francisco, who happened to already be married. It turned out to be Pete Buttigieg, right? But we had actually called this out. There's going to be a time now where people, and it turned out to be Dr. Michael Brown here, are going to start saying, well, this man is a admitted homosexual. He is clearly somebody who doesn't take his religious faith very seriously, and etc. And this is going to lead to further decline in our culture, in the moral fabric of our nation. And I completely agree. I don't think somebody like Kamala Harris should be elected president, and I don't think somebody like Pete Buttigieg should be elected president, and I do think that these kinds of things do deprave the culture and lead to further degradation of the culture. But you tell me how having a homosexual man in office is any worse than having a thrice-married serial philanderer, accused abuser, and a first lady who was quite literally a softcore porn star. I want to know, and I'm not even saying that in a way that is necessarily like they can't be forgiven or anything like that. I understand that people make mistakes. Neither one of them has said that they repent of those decisions, and they don't have to, for the record. This is the United States of America. They can actually do what they want. But from a perspective not only of my religious faith, but of just conservatism and respect for my traditional values, right? How is it not hypocritical for us to say we support this man, but because Kamala Harris may have been, a adulteress, or because Pete Buttigieg might be a homosexual or something like that, right? Now all of a sudden that's going to lead to massive moral decay, and we need to turn people away from that. The thing is I do agree we do need to turn people away from that. We do need to make sure that people like Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris and etc. are not actually, their behaviors are not accepted, and unless they are truly repentant of these behaviors, not in a religious way, but just in a way that says, I am not that person anymore, then we should not have them in public office. People in public office should be held to a higher standard than the rest of us. And to be fair, we should be holding everybody to high standards, right? It doesn't mean we become judgmental and start throwing stones or anything like that, but it does mean we lend a helping hand when people are in the muck and filth of amorality and immorality and try to pull them out of it, right? And there is a difference in the way that you approach it, but nonetheless, this is a very hypocritical thing for me. And as a result of that, and the whole point of this rant and diatribe, I think Pete Buttigieg is the most, and I've actually said this since day one, the most dangerous candidate to the Republicans and to conservatism and to our country out of any of the candidates. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, Bernie Sanders is an admitted, I keep saying admitted, but it's admitted, communist, right? He's somebody who is clearly on the far left, regressive end of the culture war. He's somebody who is very globalist, and, he's obviously a little bit batty and is octogenarian at this point, so could potentially get battier just as a matter of, his mind depleting, and we understand all those things. Although I would say that, to be fair, I think the possibility of your mind depleting in the future because you're old is not actually a good reason to go against, to vote against you. I think that's an unfair point levied against Senator Sanders. I do think it's a fair point levied against Senator Biden, former Vice President Biden, whichever you prefer to call him, because his age does seem to actually affect him literally. He's not, potentially going to reach that point. He's at that point now. But nonetheless, with Sanders, I don't think that's a problem, and I think it's unfair. And realistically speaking, the same thing would apply to Trump because he's like 73 years old. Which I don't think should be applied to Trump either, right? Anyways, not the point. Point is, so I have been saying consistently that I think it's actually Pete Buttigieg, not Sanders, not one of the, intersectionally perfect candidates like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren or etc. Not even the moderates, quote unquote, like Amy Klobuchar and Joe Biden. The most dangerous candidate to this nation and to Donald Trump and to conservatives everywhere is definitely Pete Buttigieg. And let me tell you why. First off, there is somewhat of a trend of Democrats actually taking somebody who's not particularly well known and running with him all the way to the White House. This happened with Barack Obama, this happened with Bill Clinton, and this happened with Jimmy Carter. Neither of them were particularly well known, They had only had political offices for a short period of time. In the case of Obama, I mean, he was senator for 2 years, a whopping 2 years, right? And he became the president of the United States kind of coming out of nowhere. It's a very easy kind of thing to pull off, honestly, because if you think about it, if you have a crowded field of candidates full of a bunch of people who, have either really no support but are kind of just floating around because nobody wants to, go with the other candidates, like people like Biden and Klobuchar, or you have a lot of people who actually do have a lot of very fervent support, but it's not really a lot. It's like 15, 10, 25, something like that, percent of the electorate, right? Well, if you're that guy who doesn't have any real discernible flaws, people kind of like you, you talk smoothly, there's not a lot in your past that can actually be held against you because you haven't done a lot in your past, then it's pretty easy to coast to the nomination bare minimum, right? When it comes to the actual one-on-one when they're debating each other, quite frankly, despite the homosexuality and despite the fact that Pete Buttigieg is very hypocritical in that regard because he's really the most evangelical Christian on the platform for the Democrats, right? He does have a lot, especially in the eyes of the secular society we live in today, a lot more moral ground to stand on than Trump does, or at least than Trump appears to, right? He has only been married once. He doesn't have any sort of fraud or anything like that following him behind. Nobody's ever accused him of abuse with serious charges. He doesn't have any ties to somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, you know what I mean? He's not a habitual liar, at least not somebody who has a record of habitually lying. He is definitely a habitual liar, but he doesn't have a record of habitually lying, right? And that's the thing with these people who don't have these records, is there's not very much you can pin on them. On top of that, he does actually happen to meet some intersectional guidelines, being a homosexual, and his religion is something that he can use against conservatives. A, because it makes it look like conservative Christians are hateful. I'm not saying conservative Christians are hateful. I'm not saying I agree with that. I am saying that that is what it makes it look like in the eyes of the secular society that we live in. And B, it makes it look like you can totally be somebody who lives an incredibly religiously fundamental life without actually having these sort of quote-unquote mean, hateful ideologies. And also, by the way, 3, and really probably most importantly, he actually points out the hypocrisy of the right. Really, Pete Buttigieg is this terrible guy because he's a homosexual and a hypocrite for being, a Christian while a homosexual, and a hypocrite for calling out people for their lack of faith while supporting abortion and things like that, right? But Trump having fraud, Trump being thrice married, all these other kinds of things, those aren't a problem, right? And I find that, quite frankly, to be Trump's biggest Achilles heel. He does not have a solid moral track record, and if anybody starts trying to use that against people like the Democrats, which Pete Buttigieg will just lead them right into it, because we all still believe these things, right? Michael Brown, even somebody like Rush Limbaugh, who's had his own struggles, and I who had my own struggles, right? People who have had struggles, we still actually believe this kind of old-fashioned traditionalist mentality. Mark Dice, Alex Jones, right? Even they still believe this old-fashioned traditionalist mentality. So they're going to try and use this against Pete Buttigieg. And the basic fact of the matter is you can't. You sacrifice your ability to do that when you decide that really this morality thing is actually contingent on policy. What you do in life doesn't really matter if I have policies, or if you have policies, rather, that I happen to agree with politically. And I think that's going to be called out. Now, I don't know that Pete Buttigieg is actually going to win. I hope he doesn't win. I do think Trump is the lesser of two evils out of those two for a lot of reasons. Number one, if I can get slightly conspiratorial, he's definitely establishment. He's establishment in almost every way that you can think of, whether that be somebody who happens to, follow establishment faiths and be a part of establishment groups, like, for example, being a former, and I think actually current Roman Catholic, or being a member of the establishment wing of the Democrats, or Democrats, excuse me, got to remember their gang affiliation, or whether it's the fact that he is somebody who's adored by the media, which is established, right, or somebody who believes in the established global order, which, by the way, I know everybody thinks that sounds really conspiratorial. New World Order exists whether you like it or not. The question is it a good thing, or is it a bad thing, and also, is there any sort of nefarious means behind it? You may disagree with me on those questions, but the basic fact of the matter is there is an acknowledged new world order. That's why we have things like the United Nations, NATO, globalization. This is something debated in every nation now. It's not hidden, right? But nonetheless, now will Buttigieg win is really the question here, and I don't think he will. I think Sanders, honestly, will probably win. I actually had originally thought that it was going to appear that Sanders would win, and then Biden would end up coasting through. And I said if Buttigieg or O'Rourke win, then there would be serious trouble for Trump and the Republicans. Now, at least one of those has turned out to be true, or two of those, right? Because technically that's 4 points. In that Sanders does appear to be winning throughout, and that Buttigieg will end up being the most threatening candidate. Now, Buttigieg actually ended up being a lot more threatening than I initially thought, because he actually appears to be pretty popular. He came in first place in Iowa and second place in New Hampshire, if my sources here are correct. So, I mean that's pretty. There's a likely chance, right? There's a growing likely chance that he actually does become the Democratic nomination. And I think that'll be very problematic for cultural conservatives, any sort of old-fashioned conservatives, and a lot of evangelicals supporting Trump. It's going to really call that hypocrisy to the floor. And here's the thing. Trump's nomination in 2016 has already kind of exposed the left and their hypocrisy. It exposed them. All the celebrities said that a celebrity can't be president. And now we have celebrities in politics nonstop. All the billionaires came against the billionaire president. And now we have a man with $50 billion, a man with $1.5 billion, and this is, Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, respectively, who are running for president, as well as multiple other billionaires like Oprah Winfrey and like Bob Iger and like, what was that dude's name? The one who I actually didn't mind too much, Howard Schultz, right? Who were claiming to run for the same thing against him, so that they could represent, going against billionaires, quote unquote. And we have these people saying, oh, he's so immoral, he sexually objectifies women, says Beyonce, who twerks on stage, and Jennifer Lopez, who strip dances in this Super Bowl halftime show, and Jay-Z, who says, I have 99 problems, but a bitch ain't one. Excuse my French, but that is the lyrics, right? And it really did expose this, and in so many other ways, too. It exposed them being, supportive of Islam, despite saying that Christianity is sexist and homophobic and transphobic and all that, even though Islam is going out of its way to kill these people, right? We just happen to disagree with the behaviors. And you can go down the line, so on and so forth, of all these different places of hypocrisy. And Trump did expose that hypocrisy, and it's one of the reasons why I've actually thought, when people say that Trump is sent from God, I actually think that is true. Because I think he basically just exposed this country for what it has truly become. It's not a Christian nation anymore. It is a secular and, quite frankly, godless nation. And I don't want to get too much into that, because the religious aspects of it I will be discussing on a 30-minute Unapologetics Light coming up here soon. But nonetheless, when it comes to this issue, right, I just wanted to point out, I think Buttigieg, if he wins, is going to be a huge problem. I'm kind of rambling and getting off of my points, because like I was saying, I don't think he's going to win. It looks like Sanders is going to win now. And I don't think Sanders will win the general nomination, because he's crazy and everybody can see it. The thing about Buttigieg is he's very good at hiding his socialism. And I think that's going to be a problem. But nonetheless, I've ranted on this for 23 minutes. I wanted to keep that under 10 minutes. That basically is as long as Unapologetics Light. So let's go right into the stuff we need to talk about today. The first thing I want to talk about is actually Julian Assange. So here you can see on the screen from Sputnik, the writer here is Demond Curtin. UK, US, Sweden ignoring rule of law in Assange case and continued breakdown in international norms. And again, this is from Sputnik. The editor-in-chief to one of the world's leading media organizations attended a rally in London on press freedom to denounce attempts by the UK government to extradite Julian Assange to the United States, where the acclaimed journalist could face up to 175 years in prison. I've always wondered why they give such ridiculous sentiments like that, as if anybody is ever actually going to serve 175 years in prison. But at any rate, I'm going to butcher this last name just so you guys are aware. Kristen Hrafnsson, or Hrafnsson, however you say that, I'm going to go with Hrafnsson, editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks and award-winning journalist, discussed the latest updates on his media outlet's founder on on his media outlets founder, Julian Assange, in addition to the wider implications of the breakdown in international law ahead of two crucial hearings for the Australian publisher in February and May. Assange was recently moved out of solitary confinement and into the communal area of HMS Belmarsh Prison. How did this come about? Kristen answers, of course, complaints were issued by lawyers, and we have been working behind the scenes to put pressure on prison authorities to alleviate Julian Assange's situation, which was extraordinarily detrimental to his health in the last few months. May I also point out there was also a smear campaign against Mr. Assange, saying things like, he had gone completely insane and was smearing feces over the walls of his compound and all this other kind of stuff, which there was no evidence behind. It was just simply designed to try and make him look like a kook, right? But nonetheless, we'll continue here. We also noticed that there were outside pressures regarding conservation about his health and protest from supporters, which began to have an effect, which was noticed by the broader community, and papers began to cover this fact that was now common knowledge. So they couldn't hide from the general public anymore. Thirdly, which was very heartening, was the prisoners in Belmarsh began petitioning the UK government to move Assange out of isolation at the health ward into a more public place where he could fraternize and socialize with other inmates. It's extraordinary that you can find more humanity with hardened criminals in Belmarsh than the government officials that signed off on his extradition. And of course, these government officials are used to this kind of thing. Right, British government officials were had helping hands in the murders of Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans. They were trying to ensure that Tommy Robinson was stuck in prison, and were giving him a lot of the same treatment that they give to Julian Assange. We, of course, have their ridiculous policies as far as, banning cars in certain areas and making sure you need a TV license and all this other nonsense. How long it took them to get the Brexit, all this other... they don't care about the lives, the liberties, the opinions, or anything else of the people they happen to have governance over, is basically my point. The Council of Europe finally... This is Sputnik again. The Council of Europe finally released a declaration calling for Assange's release and denouncing extradition requests to the United States. Man, the day that I agree with an international body, right? That's lame. But, dead clock is right twice a day, I guess. What kind of pressure do you think this will place on the UK government? Why is it so significant? Mr. Tariq Ali spoke about the breakdown in international norms. International norms are just politics if people decide not to abide by them and they lose their meaning. We've been seeing a breakdown in international law through outrageous actions such as the Jamal Khashoggi, killing and the targeted assassination of a high-level official in Iran, Qasem Soleimani, via drone attack. These were executions. And the Soleimani one, there's a little bit of nuance there. I will point out as my own opinion, going away from the article, I understand that that's not quite the same as Khashoggi. Khashoggi was obviously a journalist who was just brutally murdered by the Saudi government. I don't think that was quite the same thing with Soleimani. But nonetheless, just wanted to point that out there. So we're starting to see things get worse than we've seen before. In Assange's case, that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, a really important human rights body in Geneva, concluded that Assange had been arbitrarily detained and ordered the UK and Sweden to change his situation whilst he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in Knightsbridge, but he was totally ignored. And to be fair, to a certain extent, he should be ignored. This is an interesting situation in the sense that what they are doing is definitely very wrong, but obviously the internationalization of politics is not something that we agree with here by any stretch of the imagination. Globalism is not a good thing. I definitely like that people are condemning this and are saying that they are not fond of it, that they don't think this is the way things should be. But this should be happening in the US and in the UK in particular. There shouldn't be any power given any global organization for it. It astonishes me because what does it imply? It means that the next time the UNWGAD, as before, focuses on a political prisoner in a third world or developing country where the rule of law is deemed to be lesser than our perfect world, of course no one is going to listen. They will say, why should we abide by international norms when the UK and Sweden refuse to do so? And, once again, this is an interesting situation because there's international norms, but they should go unspoken, I guess is my thing, right? We should have morals that we abide by, but there should not be laws that the United Nations is putting down that all of the nations are forced to abide by. We are sovereign nations. The United Nations, quite frankly, shouldn't even exist, and that makes this all, a very interesting sort of a situation here. That being said, though, I do certainly agree that Julian Assange is being horribly mistreated. That's another one that I think Trump should completely and totally exonerate via a pardon. If the UK wants to, go ahead and treat him like a political prisoner, they can, but the United States should have no part in it. And quite frankly, if he's able to get over here, which I highly doubt at this point, he's obviously in custody there. But I think he should be given something akin to, what do they call that? Asylum status. The same applies to the findings of UN Special Reporter on Torture, Niles Melzer, who said that international law was shunned, didn't register, and didn't have any meaning in the UK courts, where a judge said that when Assange was sentenced to a ridiculously harsh sentence for breaching bail conditions, which is normally settled with a fine or conditional sentencing. So we're seeing a breakdown in international law, and I'm unsure what kind of pressure the Council of Europe can impose, but every bit counts, and it was really heartening to see the Council pass this resolution on press freedom and directly address Julian's situation to recognize how important it was. See, and this is where I definitely disagree with the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief here. I'm not going to continue to try and say his last name because, quite frankly, I'm not very good at it. But nonetheless, when it comes to Julian Assange, there is definitely, absolutely problems in the Julian Assange case. For example, the fact that he is being charged at all when, quite frankly, he is a hero is insane. He already had charges that are notably bogus, right? There was already a noted smear campaign against him. The fact that journalists are actually okay with the fact that another journalist is being prosecuted for doing journalism is completely asinine. And quite frankly, the only journalists who seem to have a problem with this are some of the quote-unquote radical and fringe types, like Stephen Bannon, like Alex Jones. I've yet to see anything from Mark Dice on it. I'm pretty sure that the Natural News guy, I can't remember his name, Mike Adams maybe. Nonetheless, he's been against it. So at least he was against it before the arrest. I haven't heard anything since the arrest, so I guess I can't definitively say that. Tucker Carlson is the only mainstream one who I've heard come out against this. A bunch of other people have been saying, he's a Russian asset and, all this kind of nonsense. And the reason is because he exposed them, right? It's one thing for somebody like Alex Jones to expose people via, evidences of FEMA camps and evidences of, executive orders and things like that, where the federal government can basically come in and take our transportation and food supply and things like that, which, by the way, I know Alex Jones has had a negative reputation as of the last really decade. You really need to look into his 1990s and 2000s work, and even some early 2010s work, because quite frankly, the man's past, he was one of the greatest journalists of all time. But nonetheless, it is one thing to expose those kinds of things. It is a completely different thing to, in a non-conspiratorial fashion, right? Not having to dig up these laws that, to a certain extent, are obscure, right? You have to kind of take people like Alex Jones's word for it, and of course, if you fact check them, they do turn out to be true. But what Julian Assange brought you is he actually brought you the leaks, right? Here's the evidence right here that they are actually manipulating climate data to make it look like there is man-made climate change. No, here's the evidence right here that Bernie Sanders was definitely, not only was he cheated out of the Democratic primary, but actually he was in on it eventually, right? Here's the evidence right here that there is some weird kind of, I'm not necessarily going Pizzagate, right, but there's some weird language around the John Podesta and around Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and etc. No, here's the evidence that Hillary Clinton did, in fact, delete a bunch of emails and etc. You can go down the line, right? And that is why people don't actually approve of Julian Assange, is because Julian Assange brought you cold, hard facts, right? Now, there are problems with some of the stuff Julian Assange did, I admit. I happen to agree with Edward Snowden, another American hero, by the way, who actually said that Julian Assange was not actually careful enough with his information, In one case being the Chelsea Manning case in particular. Chelsea Manning had actually, given this information that was showing that there was complete and total indiscriminate killing of citizens, sometimes even torture of citizens, right, going on in Iraq, which was an illegal war we shouldn't have been in the first place. And I don't mean illegal in the sense of international law, though it was, but I mean illegal by the standards set up by our own nation, and illegal by any sort of just war theory or scripture, just for the record. But nonetheless, right, completely amoral war. Nonetheless, there was indiscriminate killings, tortures, beatings, and things like that going on against innocent civilians, sometimes even women and children, in this illegal war, and this was being covered up by high-ranking officials. And Chelsea Manning actually did the brave thing, and he came out and decided, I am not going to allow this to happen. I'm going to report this, and he gave the information to WikiLeaks, right? Admittedly, in that whole situation, WikiLeaks published a lot of information they should not have. They published personal information. They published the locations of, troops that could have got them killed and things of that nature. And I could go, a little bit further in depth. But the fact of the matter is, Julian Assange did actually end up endangering people's lives in that regard. And this is a criticism brought against him by Edward Snowden that I actually do happen to agree with. However, I think that at most we should call Julian at that, and hopefully he gives us a sincere apology, but I don't think that's warranting any sort of criminal charges, or if it does, the criminal charges would be akin to a fine, because quite frankly, the information he provided did need to be provided. Quite frankly, there should be laws protecting whistleblowers, and the last I checked, they're supposed to be, but, they don't ever actually work. Nonetheless, the point of that is just to say, I know there are legitimate criticisms to actually bring to WikiLeaks. And, even South Park actually pointed this out once with their episode, WikiLeaks and Lemmy Winks. It's hilarious, but nonetheless, they're pointing out how when this guy can just go in and expose people's information like this, it is kind of dangerous. Also a fair criticism. But how is that any different than somebody like Chris Cuomo coming up and saying, we can have and access the tax returns of President Donald Trump, for example, right? Even though that would be illegal for somebody like me to do. Although I guess, I don't know if you need like a media license or something to have that, or if you're just I don't know what associates you with being in the media. Whatever, not the point, right? The point being that these criticisms you can levy about Assange, they're still not criticisms that would warrant him being arrested, or if they did warrant him being arrested, they definitely have to get a lot of other people over it, certainly not news and MSNBC and etc. arrested, right? But the reason that they don't see it that way, even though I'm pretty sure they do see it that way, I have a feeling this doesn't go over their head. They're just hypocritical on this notion, and it's because he exposes them. They don't like him because he exposes them. A lot of people on the left actually even would go as far as to blame him for the loss of the 2016 election, which I don't actually think is true, but, you can do with that information what you will, I guess. The fact of the matter is, in my opinion, the man is a hero, quite frankly. He is a American hero, Australian hero, a British hero. He is a hero to free speech worldwide. He may have done things in a way sometimes that he should not have done things, and we can criticize for that, and have our sort of our dialogues and things of that nature. But I don't think the treatment that he's receiving is even close to warranted. And you're seeing very similar things with other journalists. Owen Stroyer was recently arrested here in the United States. Khashoggi was obviously murdered, outright murdered. We saw Tommy Robinson, right, being arrested and then charged and then exonerated and then recharged, right? Spent something like a total of 4 or 5 months actually in jail. A lot of that time being in solitary confinement. Although it was in some of the jail sentences were broken up over time, but nonetheless, you are seeing it's becoming more and more dangerous to become a journalist, because the governments actually of the so-called free world are not only endorsing people in the in the not so free world like Saudi Arabia doing some of the things that they're doing, but on top of that are actually doing some of those things, but to a lesser extent. Nobody's been killed so far, right, on our own turf. Deplatforming Alex Jones, arresting Tommy Robinson, arresting Owen Stroyer. You know what I mean? Making sure that Julian Assange is charged was absolutely ridiculous. Facing up to 175 years in prison. For what? For what? Rapists and murderers don't receive that kind of a sentence, and you're going to put Julian Assange in prison for 175 years. Are you joking me? Where's the charges against Hillary Clinton? And by the way, back to that Trump corruption, right? The DOJ is willing to go after Julian Assange. The DOJ is willing to go after people like Edward Snowden and say he's never allowed back on this, on the soil and things of that nature, right? But they won't go after criminals in the IRS, won't go after the Clintons, like President Trump actually promised during the 2016 run, right? Not going to go after Obama, not going to go after some of the people who are in government now, like Pelosi, like McConnell, like the Bushes, you know what I'm saying? And you know what? Honestly, I know why they're not going to do it, because they'd have to go after Trump as well. The thing is, and this whole thing is criminals versus criminals, and each of them accusing them of crimes that sometimes they committed, sometimes they didn't. But they're all criminals. They're just gangs. They're a bunch of big gangs. They're self-interested, and Julian Assange is a perfect example of this. But nonetheless, that's my take on that. I found this incredibly interesting and honest, so I wanted to read about it. This is from the New York Post, written by John Levin. Chris Matthews warned of executions in Central Park if socialism wins. This was honestly a shocking thing. This was a shocking development, in my opinion, because I always kind of figured Chris Matthews was a closet socialist. Turns out, though he's definitely pretty far to the left, I guess maybe he's not a socialist, right? Maybe he doesn't think that is a good idea here. Because not only did he say that there'd be executions in Central Park, giving a very harsh critique of socialism, but he actually went as far as to say that he'd be one of those executed. And I actually happen to agree with him, for the record, especially if he was saying things like this. But, even in his past, Chris Matthews, much as I can't stand the man, he's certainly not the type of person who any establishment, one-party government would ever want to keep around, right? As are a lot of lefty journalists, actually. Quite frankly, anybody who doesn't toe the specific and perfect status quo is going to be eliminated, right? I think that leaves Brian Stelter and everybody on Certainly Not News, honestly, but definitely not anyone else. Maybe you can make an argument for Rachel Maddow, but even Rachel Maddow, Ellen DeGeneres would be out because she's fraternized with people on the other side, although, the other side, quote-unquote, you could argue, the Bushes are pretty buddy-buddy with the Clintons, always have been buddy-buddy with a lot of lefties. Nonetheless, not the point. Point is, Chris Matthews was being incredibly honest, and I admired it, and I agree with him, and we're going to read about it. So let's do that. Better Dead Than Red, said Chris Matthews. The MSNBC host went into a protracted monologue after the Democratic debate in New Hampshire Friday night, in which he condemned the evils of socialism and warned of public executions in Central Park if it ever came to the United States. Quote, I have my own views of the word socialist, and I'll be glad to share them with you in private, and they go back to the early 1950s, end quote, he told a post-debate analyst panel. Quote, I have an attitude about them. I remember the Cold War. I have an attitude toward Fidel Castro, he added. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of those getting executed. And certain other people would be there cheering, end quote. And he's 100% right about that. And allow me to name names in this situation. Those other people would be people like Greta Thunberg, like Bernie Sanders, like AOC, right? Like even Pete Buttigieg, let's be perfectly clear. Like all those people you adore in the celebrity sphere, like Cardi B and etc., right? It would be them. That was end quote, by the way, before my little portion. I forgot to have the end quote. Maybe I didn't. Not important. Matthews declined to get into who exactly he thought would have been cheering his execution. Happy to name the names for you, sir. Quote, I don't know who Bernie supports over these years. I don't know what he means by socialism. 1 week it's Denmark. We're going to be like Denmark. Matthew continued, mocking Sanders' deep Brooklyn accent. Well then, what does he think of Castro? That's a great question. What do you think of Fidelissimo? End quote. And of course, back in the day, he was very supportive of Venezuela and etc. The moment swiftly went viral on Twitter and was picked up by pro-Trump surrogates like campaign spokesman Tim Murtaugh. Quote, Chris Matthews laying it down, end quote, he said approvingly in a tweet. Before becoming the host of MSNBC's show Hardball, Matthews spent his career as an insider in Democratic politics, as a speechwriter for former President Jimmy Carter, and as chief of staff to former House Speaker Tip O'Neill. Now, I understand that people on the conservative side are going to politicize this, And, maybe even to a certain extent that's a good thing because we don't want socialism. But I think this is a moment of very serious honesty on the, we were saying a bunch about Mitt Romney, right? Mitt Romney is going up against Trump. And I actually agreed with Mitt Romney, not in the sense that Trump should be impeached, because I don't think Trump was guilty of the crimes they accused him of, but in the sense that if that is truly your conviction, then that is definitely what you should do. That was a moment of honesty, and it was a very dangerous moment, and it basically completely and totally removed Mitt Romney from his base. It removed him from the party status quo. He challenged a lot there, and he lost a lot for it in the eyes of his own personal base. Maybe not in the eyes of the establishment. And you guys can argue that back and forth in the comment section if you like. But nonetheless, Chris Matthews here is going a lot farther than that, though. Chris Matthews is, I think going against what, unfortunately, whether or not he would admit it, his entire life's work has ended up being dedicated to. Because unfortunately, and this is what I like to, I always say this when I'm talking to my friends. I don't know if I've ever said it, on video. What we should tell people who are actually willing to speak with us, who aren't, evil, anti-gun, anti-constitutional, rabid dogs, quite frankly, trying to go after us all the time, trying to make sure we don't have any liberties and etc. When we have these conversations with a Tulsi Gabbard, with an Andrew Yang, maybe with a Chris Matthews or with a Piers Morgan, maybe with a Larry King or a Jesse Ventura or a Joe Rogan or a Dave Rubin or whoever it happens to be, a Jimmy Dore, right? It doesn't matter. What we need to tell them is, I understand that this is not your intention, but what we are seeing currently from the rabid left is, in fact, the inevitable position that all nations get into when they follow your ideology. People talk about following things to its logical conclusion, and I think a lot of people mistakenly think of that as strictly thought experiments that the intellectuals and the academia do. But quite frankly, human beings are naturally logical creatures, and we will follow the natural logical implications of our ideologies regardless of if we've ever thought them through, right? It's almost like second nature. It becomes instinctual. This is why you have people who 10 years ago would never in a million years support something like late-term abortion, now getting up and saying plainly, late-term abortion all the way up to birth, and it should be paid for by the United States government. It's not that they were secretly hiding back in the day. It's that they're following their ideology to their logical conclusions, and as a result, they've changed and become more radical. Radicalism, honestly, is kind of natural in the sense that people are just more and more drawn to the positions that are, to the logical conclusions, rather, of the positions they hold. But nonetheless, with that, Chris Matthews he's being incredibly brave. He's being incredibly honest. It's got to be a somber moment for him. It's got to be a moment of self-reflection when he's coming out and he's saying, "Look, I'm frightened that if socialism would have won, I would be one of those people executed, and certain people here would be cheering," implying that that could happen again here in Central Park. And there's people now who would still be cheering. And if I'm being perfectly frank with you, I agree with Chris Matthews. And I think he should be commended for it. I don't think he should be derided for it. I don't think we should politicize this. I think this is a moment where we need to recognize, just like, Dave Rubin's waking up, just like Joe Rogan actually deciding he was going to talk to the other side. We need to all wake up and understand socialism cannot be, it's just like fascism in that regard. You may not have those intentions. And quite frankly, a lot of fascists didn't have those intentions. But that is the inevitable conclusion of the ideology which you follow. And we need to wake up and turn away from that. And I to a certain extent, I wonder if it's even possible at this point. We're so far down the line. But if it is, may God be glorified, and let's do so. Let's move on, though. Other topics here today. Haaretz. Watch U.S. envoy at UN. Trump Mideast peace plan is subject to changes. Now, this is incredibly important that this is subject to changes. Why? Well, because it's been rejected by the Palestinians, number one, and number two, it is almost identical to the Vatican peace plan, but as we had pointed out before, there are some very small differences, and it looks like those differences might indeed, end up coming to fruition. Some of those differences that we had seen here were that it wasn't the integrity of Judea and Samaria, commonly miscalled, the West Bank. That was actually going to be given over to the Palestinians, and also that even though Jerusalem would be internationalized, it wouldn't necessarily be internationalized in the sense that it's a UN city or an international city where nobody has any sort of jurisdiction, or that it would give it over to the Vatican or anything like that, but rather that Jordan and Israel and probably Palestine would end up being added into this as well, considering they would actually have their capital in East Jerusalem. But basically that they would sort of share, political jurisdiction over the area. But now we're seeing that the envoy is saying that this plan is subject to change. And I could certainly see those changes being basically us getting these little points of the old 1999 Vatican plan back. For example, internationalizing the old city in a way that would allow for, the Jews to pray at the Temple Mount, the temple to be rebuilt, but also us to keep the status quo. Internationalizing the old city in a way that would make it to where Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and etc. would all be able to go there. Internationalizing it in such a way that the old city doesn't actually belong to anybody but those who were given custodianship of it, like the Vatican or the United Nations. Or potentially even both. It could be the Vatican by enforcement of the United Nations. You never know, right? Another one of those changes, I could see something along the lines of, maybe we actually end up seeing all of the area, Judea and Samaria, actually being given to the Palestinians, but with some sort of a asterisk there that says you can't militarize, and also the settlements there actually have to be considered legitimate and need to be able to have kind of their own religious law there, because a lot of them, of course, are Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. Which I'm sure the same sort of thing would probably be moved in Israel. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and get into the actual article rather than just my predictions of what could possibly come. Palestinian President Abbas, that's hilarious that you can be considered the president of a country that doesn't exist. Palestinian President Abbas tells Security Council that the plan rewards the occupation, describes future state envisioned by Trump as Swiss cheese. To be fair, that's not 100% incorrect. But, Abbas wouldn't, by any, stretch of the imagination, recognize the fact that the exact same thing is indeed true of Israel at that point, being is that they would actually have, something like 9-10 miles at their narrowest, the being the width of their country. But nonetheless, the Trump administration's Mideast plan is a basis for negotiations and could be subject to changes, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Kelly Craft said Tuesday at the UN Security Council, convened to discuss the plan. A senior Trump administration official said after the Security Council session that Washington, D.C. is willing to have an honest and open discussion on the plan as a possible basis to restart negotiations for a realistic two-state solution. As we've said all along, our plan is the start of a process, not the end. End quote. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said Trump's plan seeks to, quote, put an end to the question of Palestine, end quote, as he addressed the session earlier. Abbas said that the fact that the plan does not establish East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, what? See, now this is why you can't trust these guys over on the Palestinian side. It very clearly did establish East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. So what is he saying here? He's saying that, because you didn't actually give us East Jerusalem, he did give you East Jerusalem. It's one of the things I was sitting up here lambasting him for last week. So what are you talking about, sir? And of course, this is all just a ploy so that he can get him and his anti-Zionist friends to actually get to what is the actual end stated goal, which is complete and total destruction of the Jewish state. Abbas said that the fact that the plan does not establish East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine was enough to require its rejection, describing the Palestinian state envisioned by the plan as Swiss cheese, and asking who would accept a similar state and a similar condition. Well, apparently Israel, because they just did. They allowed you to have a tunnel through their land. They're giving you historical land that belongs to them. They're making themselves only 9 miles wide. And by the way, none of that I agree with. Let me be perfectly clear. I have views very similar to that of Meir Kahane, both as it pertains to Israel and as it pertains to my own nation, the United States. Quite frankly, everything in what we would call Israel proper, everything in Judea and Samaria, and everything in Gaza belongs to Israel. Everything in the Golan Heights also belongs to Israel because the Arabs decided they were going to pick a fight, and they lost. And when you lose territory. And as Meir Kahane said, everything up from the Nile to the Euphrates was promised to us in Genesis. So we're not going to take it. But if you want to continuously attack us, well, not saying we wouldn't be justified in taking it, right? And I happen to agree with that sort of thing. You don't play around with people who ask for your total destruction, right? The fact of the matter is, you started a war, you then lost the war, so you have to face the ramifications of losing that war. And that is why I believe the Golan Heights belongs to them. But even disregarding the question of the Golan Heights, I mean, the land that is most fundamental to Israel is indeed Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, right? So those aren't even on the table for questioning. Gaza also belonged to the United Monarchy of Israel, belongs to the Jewish people during the tribal times, during the times that Judea and Samaria were split. I'm pretty sure it even belonged to them during the Hasmonean dynasty, right? It is not Palestine. Palestine does not exist. And according to the Balfour Declaration, all the people who are quote-unquote Palestinian is, everybody always asks, well, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? You know what? They deserve their own country too. They have their own country. It's called Jordan. The king of Jordan is, here we are talking about international law, should be required by international law, by the fact that the Balfour Declaration was put in place, right? Should be required to take these Palestinian people. He doesn't, because it won't allow him to get towards his end goal, which is, of course, destruction of the Jewish state. It's the destruction of the Jewish state in the eyes of every Arab and every Muslim who is currently in leadership there. That doesn't mean every single one of them individually, but that is currently in leadership there in the Middle East. It is their goal. And that is why I don't think we should be supporting these kinds of things at all. At all, right? People want to say, well, is that our business? Well, quite frankly, no, it really isn't. But I'm still going to give my opinion on it, number one, because I just do that sort of thing. And number two, as long as we are going to have policy about these sorts of nations, then, we're going to have to talk about it. Boss said that the fact, I already read that. Following the session on Tuesday, former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said that Abbas is Israel's only partner for peace in a joint press conference with the Palestinian leader in New York, in which Abbas called for a resumption of peace talks from where they left off during Olmert's term. In his statement, Olmert said that the Israeli-Palestinian peace requires direct negotiations between the two sides. He described Abbas as the only representative of the Palestinian people who is willing to negotiate with Israel, also praising him for fighting terrorism. The former prime minister, however, refrained from criticizing the American peace plan for the Middle East directly. Quote, "I don't miss an opportunity to do that in Israel, but I'm going to do that here," end quote, he said. Speaking after Abbas, Israel's UN ambassador, Danny Danon, praised the Trump plan, saying that what it, quote, does differently is refusing to accept the same out-of-date concept of previous plans, end quote, and refuses to accept that the only solution to the formula that has failed over the last 70 years, end quote. See, I don't understand that. I don't understand why people believe that. In all reality, the amount of land that he actually gives to Israel in this situation, they say this is the most Zionist plan anyone's ever put forward. The amount of land he actually gives to Israel, comparatively to the land that was given to Israel before in these other plans, is maybe the size of Long Island. You know what I mean? It is, in fact, probably significantly less than that. It is not a large amount of land by any stretch of the imagination. And you can go look at the plan for yourself. In fact, I'm fairly certain there was a picture of it up here, wasn't there? Let's see here. Yeah, see? Look at that. Look at that. That is the exact same. Oh, maybe it's not 9 miles. Maybe it's like 12 or something like that. You know what I mean? But it's not like this is somehow radically different from the plans that people had before, right? And saying that it's subject to change. Well, subject to change in what way? The Jews have already accepted it. So clearly that would be in pro-Palestinian ways. What do you think that's going to be? Potentially it'll be extension of these borders. Much more potentially, I think it'll have to do with Jerusalem and internationalizing. But nonetheless, let's continue. In his statement, Olmert said, I already read that. Speaking after Abbas, Israel says that this does differently. What it does differently is refusing the added. You know, I already read that too. Dannon also accused Abbas of not being a serious partner for peace, saying that if he were serious about negotiations, he would be in Jerusalem or Washington. Quote, progress towards peace will not be made so long as President Abbas remains in his position, Dannon said. Only when he steps down can Israel and the Palestinians move forward. A leader who chooses rejectionism, incitement, and glorification of terror can never be a real partner for peace, end quote. I happen to agree with that. And that's another thing that I definitely disagree with as far as Prime Minister Olmert was concerned. This idea that he's been fighting against terrorism and is somehow this great partner for peace. I mean, I don't know what world you're living in, Mr. Olmert. But nonetheless, Abbas hit back at claims that the Palestinians have wasted opportunities for peace, saying that these are silly slogans, and that the Palestinians remain committed to the Oslo Accords. The Palestinian president further said, quote, I would like to reaffirm that we reject the fact that they are linking economic assistance to a political solution. First, a political solution, and then, if you wish to help us, we welcome that help. The plan rewards the occupation instead of holding it accountable for all the crimes it has perpetrated against our people and our land, end quote, Abbas said. Quote, this plan will not bring peace or stability to the region, and therefore we will not accept this plan. We will confront its application on the ground, end quote, Abbas noted. Abbas noted that several countries and international bodies, as well as many Israelis and Americans, have rejected the plan, showing a document signed by dozens of U.S. lawmakers and one signed by 300 Israelis. Steps toward annexation of parts of the West Bank would have been a devastating effect on the prospect of the two-state solution to the conflict. The UN's Mideast envoy, Nikolai Mladenov, I think is how you say that? Mladenov, we're going to go with, said at the beginning of the session. Mladenov reaffirmed the UN's official position that peace can only be achieved with a two-state solution along the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Notice the UN plan, the Trump plan that we have now, and the plan with Israel, or not with Israel, with the Vatican, really only differentiate in semantics, and that is the exact extent of the Judea and Sumerian land that is given over to the Palestinians, and who exactly has control over Jerusalem. Quote, today is not enough to reaffirm your positions, end quote, Mladenov said, urging the parties to engage in negotiations. Quote, today is the time to hear proposals on how to move forward and to find our way back to a mutually agreed mediation framework, end quote, he added. Belgium's Foreign Minister Philippe Goffin, meanwhile, issued a statement on behalf of the 4 EU members of the Security Council saying, quote, we remain committed to a negotiated two-state solution based on 1967 lines, with equivalent land swaps as may be agreed upon between the parties, with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition, end quote. The Trump administration has excluded funding for the Palestinian Security Services in its budget request for the 2021 fiscal year, after 27 years of bipartisan support and Israeli backing. Trump's plan, the product of 3 years' effort by senior advisor Jared Kushner, would recognize Israel's authority over the settlements and would require the Palestinians to meet a highly difficult series of conditions to be allowed to have a state with its capital in West Bank village east of Jerusalem. With its capital in a West Bank village east of Jerusalem. There's been a slow but steady escalation in tensions between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank since the unveiling of this initiative. The Palestinian leadership, finding elusive unity, is planning to cut security ties with Israel with an ongoing trade dispute, puts increasing pressure on the Palestinian economy. One Palestinian has been killed and dozens wounded in clashes with Israeli troops since the plan's release. 17-year-old Mohammed Salman Toame al-Haddad was shot in the chest with live fire in Hebron last week and later died of his wounds. The previous week, soldiers also shot and severely wounded a 15-year-old Palestinian in the head with a rubber bullet during clashes in the northern West Bank town of Kafr Qudam. Now, of course, they're putting these out to try and guilt-trip people into supporting the Palestinian side because Haaretz is a notoriously liberal outlet. But what they're not telling you is what, of course, these kids are involved in. I'm not claiming they were involved in anything, but why was there live fire and rubber bullets being shot at these children in the first place? Probably because in reality, teenagers aren't children, and they were probably doing something illegal and terroristy. But nonetheless, Israel bolstered its security presence in the West Bank and Jerusalem after 3 separate alleged terrorist attacks injured 14 soldiers on Thursday, which, for the record, is definitely not them seeming to have they're following the letter of this particular law and not the spirit. I'll agree with that. I don't think they should be following it at all, but nonetheless. 12 were wounded, one seriously, in a car ramming attack in Jerusalem, with the suspect identified as Sanad al-Tarman, 24, in custody. In a separate incident, a Haifa resident, a 45-year-old Shadi Bana, was shot and injured, or rather did shoot and injure, a border police officer near Lionsgate outside Jerusalem's Old City. He was shot and killed after attempting to flee the scene. A conscript was also lightly wounded by gunfire near the Israeli West Bank settlement of Dolev after reportedly being shot by a passing car. And of course, this violence will continue to escalate until there is some sort of a resolution. In my personal opinion, that resolution is definitely going to come by virtue of total acceptance of the Vatican plan as proposed in 1999 and agreed to by President at the time, Shimon Peres of Israel. I think the Vatican's plan has always been to internationalize the Old City because it has all the holy sites of Jerusalem, has all the holy sites, whether it's Jewish sites, Rastafari sites, Muslim sites, Christian of Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic persuasion. The Mormons find it to be holy. The Baha'i find it to be holy. The Druze find it to be holy. And we can go down the line. So, they've always wanted that particular area, that Old City, to be in their own personal control, I think. And I don't think I should have to, go too far in explaining why that is problematic. I have, of course, explained it quite a bit here on the program, but just one more time for those who don't find this to be perfectly obvious, at least in the eyes of most, whether or not you believe this is your own prerogative, but at least in the eyes of most, holiest area in the entire world, having having custodianship, or being under the custodianship, rather, of a man who believes himself to be infallible in all spiritual and moral proclamations, and to be in place of God, right? Vicarious Christi, in place of Christ. Christ is God. Do the math for yourself, right? That is dangerous. That is incredibly dangerous, especially if he happens to be the leader of an ecumenical and interfaith body, like Shimon Peres actually proposed to this current Pope, Pope Francis, in 2014, saying that they should have a UN for religions, right? And not just Abrahamic religions, just for the record, but all religions, and that Pope Francis should head it. This is not good, not democratic, not something that is beneficial to human freedom. I would add that I think it's something that's a rather prophetic, but that's something for unapologetics. We try to stay somewhat away from spirituality on this program, but I'm a Christian. It's going to leak through, and I'm not ashamed of that. So, but nonetheless, this is supposed to be about news. I think that's what we're going to end up seeing here. How soon that happens, I don't know. But we'll see. Maybe it's 3.5 years. Wouldn't that be something that would be kind of crazy? But nonetheless, I don't know. And I think it's something that none of us can really properly deduce, considering how long it took for this proposal in the first place. But we're going to see. Maybe it turns out to be something that is, very quick. Maybe it takes a very long time. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I just happen to think that this is going to be the trajectory of this particular plan. I think they will eventually accept it in Israel and in Palestine. I have a sneaking suspicion that Netanyahu will not be there for that particular moment, because I do think he'll be ousted due to the corruption charges. And, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. But my own suspicion is that it will happen while Francis and Abbas and Trump are all in power. And I don't think Netanyahu will be in power at the time, but probably somebody like Benny Gantz. Nonetheless, unfortunately, we are already roughly 10 minutes over an hour, so I'm not going to be able to get to some of the stuff I wanted to get to. I'll leave links in the description below anyways, in case you guys want to read those articles. Let me go ahead and draw them up here for you, so you know what they would have been. Pope Francis gets involved in the political, the political ideologies of human beings, saying that tax cuts for the wealthy is a structure of sin. A structure of sin. Now remember, according to Catholic doctrine, papal infallibility says that when he speaks in his office as the leader of all Christians about moral or religious matters, he cannot possibly be wrong. So if he decides to take this, to saying that, and in fact, this is my moral proclamation for all Catholics, then according to the Catholic Church, that is infallible from God and, in fact, cannot be changed from anybody. So, there you see one of the many reasons why we have problems with him getting involved in our politics. Then we also see Pope Francis' post-Amazon Synod exhortation could be worse than everyone thinks. By intention or not, the current papacy has brought back something that we thought died in 1978. And just to give you a brief overview of what that is, it is rumored in Rome that Pope Francis may have retreated on a bit of those issues now, namely being priestly celibacy, deaconesses, and the very nature of the church. Remember, LifeSite is a Catholic organization, so they come at it from a traditionalist Catholic perspective. Very important, though. And we may even end up reading it later on anyways. Last one we were going to read, a GOP Senator, Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida, did propose... A GOP Senator proposed a constitutional amendment to raise the threshold for impeachment after the circus debacle that we ended up having to go through earlier this year, just a few weeks ago. I may not be a supporter of Trump, but I happen to recognize bogus when I see it. What's going on here? Nonetheless, doesn't really matter. Rick Scott is proposing that we raise the we have a constitutional amendment to raise the threshold for impeachment, and I happen to agree. So you can check that out if you like. So thank you guys very much for watching this program. If you like it, please do like it and share with your friends. We definitely want to get this information out to everybody. Please do subscribe here to TheCynicogue. If you like the Watchdog, we have this on hopefully every Wednesday, but really it's just an unspecified weekday, once a weekday. We want to eventually have this on every weekday, but don't make any money for that and have a pretty tight schedule, so we'll see when that happens. Also, if you're interested in Christian apologetics, we have a Christian apologetics program, Unapologetics, and Unapologetics Light. Unapologetics being an hour, much like this format, a little bit different, and Unapologetics Light being 30 minutes or less, where we do a little bit more, just shorter, not as formal kind of videos. So if you're interested in that, that's also a reason to subscribe here to TheCynicogue. We do have multiple social media accounts, as well as all of the articles that were shown here, which will be in the link in the description below. You can like us on TheCynicogue on BitChute, where you will actually only find Unapologetics Light, ACP Official on Gab, Terrestrial Earthbird on Twitter, Cynic Thought on Instagram, the American Cynic Party on Facebook, and TheCynicogue on Minds. Questions, comments, or criticisms, concerns, anything like that in the comments section below. And we certainly appreciate you watching. Shalom. And, that's all we got for you.